Hi, and welcome to the Kalamopod, the one and only podcast on themes in classical Islamic theology, hosted by me, Hannah Erlwein. Those who have been listening to the Kalamopod in the past will know that classical Islamic theologians were not simply sitting in their ivory towers, puzzling their heads over abstract theological problems, far removed from the real world. Instead, many of the questions they discussed were of direct relevance to real-life situations. For instance, maybe you remember from episode 2 that theologians used the debate whether humans have a free will or whether our fate is decided by God in order to critique the ruling elite, whom they perceived as justifying their misdeeds by claiming that their rule was divinely ordained. As this example shows, Islamic theology was frequently intertwined with politics. Or, to put it differently, there was an overlap between theological and political questions. And this brings us to today's episode of the Kalamopod. Today, we will travel back in time to the middle of the 7th century, only a few decades after the Prophet Muhammad had passed away. This was a troubled time of civil war, which arose from disputes about political authority and rulership of the Muslim community. Now, what's interesting to us as listeners of the Kalamopod is that these political disputes were expressed in distinctly theological terms. We will see that later generations of theologians investigated questions such as whether belief rested on practice or whether it was an internal conviction, or whether committing sinful actions decreased one's belief. And when they discussed these theological questions, they had in mind concrete historical disputes about political authority and rulership. The intertwinedness of theological questions and political disputes becomes especially clear when we take a closer look at how Islamic theologians wrote about one group in particular, known as the Kharijites, who contributed greatly to the political turmoil in the middle of the 7th century. So, who were the Kharijites? In order to understand this, we need to go back to the year 656, which is when the third caliph after Muhammad, Osman, was murdered. Osman was murdered by a group of people who were dissatisfied with his rule and accused him of unfairly favoring his own relatives for political offices, among other offenses. And so they demanded that he should admit to his wrongdoings. But Osman had no intention to do such a thing. The group finally forced their way into his house and killed him. As if Osman's murder did not mean enough political turmoil for the young Muslim community, more trouble was on the horizon when Ali, Muhammad's son-in-law, was made the next caliph. Not everyone was satisfied with Ali's election as caliph. Aisha, Muhammad's favorite wife, as well as Talha and Zubair, two of Muhammad's companions, decided to lead an army against Ali. The armies clashed at the so-called Battle of the Camel, named after the camel on which Aisha was riding and overlooking the battle. Well, the Battle of the Camel eventually ended with Ali's victory. Talha and Zubair were killed, and Aisha was sent back to her home in Mecca or Medina. But with the Battle of the Camel, fighting between Muslims over political authority and rulership was still not over. Only 1 year later, in 657, Ali had to face yet another army, this time led by Muawiyah. Muawiyah was the governor of Syria and Osman's cousin, and he refused to acknowledge Ali as caliph as long as the murder of his uncle, the former Caliph Osman, had not been vindicated. This led to another war, known as the Battle of Siffin. Months of fighting passed without a victor emerging. Eventually, the two sides agreed to cease fighting and to appoint arbiters who should negotiate. The negotiations infuriated a group of Ali's supporters, who demanded that Ali should continue fighting Muawiyah, who had challenged his authority as caliph. But Ali did not follow their demand, and so his former supporters dissociated themselves from him in anger and left his camp. This is the beginning of the story of the Kharijites. Their name is derived from the Arabic word kharaja, which means to go away, to withdraw, and refers to their decision of leaving Ali's camp. Although it is said that more and more dissatisfied individuals joined the Kharijites, not everyone did so, and we are told that they consequently embarked on a series of violent attacks against those who did not join their ranks. Ali did an effort to suppress the violence committed by the Kharijites, and he did manage to kill a considerable number of them. But fate had it that eventually he himself died at the hands of a Kharijite in 661. You will not be surprised to hear that the Kharijites sparked the interest of later generations of Muslim historians who wrote about the historical events I just spoke about. But there were also quite a few theologians who were interested in the religious beliefs of the Kharijites, and not just in the historical events. For example, in the 10th century, Abul Hassan al-Ash'ari wrote about the Kharijites in his book MacLeod al-Islamiyin, a book about the beliefs of all sorts of Islamic groups and individuals. Maybe you even remember al-Ash'ari from several previous episodes of the Kalamopod as the namesake of one majorly important theological school, the Ash'ariyah. In the 12th century, Muhammad ibn Abdul Karim al-Shahrastani also wrote about the Kharijites and their beliefs in his book Kitab al-Milal wa Nihal, which means Book on Sects and Divisions. Descriptions of the Kharijites, like those by al-Ash'ari and al-Shahrastani, are of course very interesting, but we should also be aware that there's a bit of an issue with these sources. All these descriptions we have of the Kharijites and their theological and political convictions come from authors who considered themselves in strong opposition to the Kharijites. We don't have any texts written by Kharijites themselves. This raises the question whether those descriptions actually do justice to the Kharijites, or whether they misrepresent them to some degree at least. Nevertheless, let's see what theologians like al-Ash'ari and al-Shahrastani have to tell us about the Kharijites. One thing that stands out is that the Kharijites considered a Muslim who committed a major sin an unbeliever. For the Kharijites, true faith was not merely an internal conviction or the profession of the faith by the tongue. Rather, true faith required the display of pious actions, and so a person's faith could be judged by others. This view held by the Kharijites had major political implications. They insisted that once a caliph had given away through impious actions, that he had abandoned his faith. It became obligatory upon all other Muslims to wage war against him. The vast majority of later theologians who wrote about the Kharijites viewed this position with horror. For them, the Kharijite position had devastating consequences for the whole Muslim community, having led to civil wars and Muslims killing fellow Muslims. This explains, at least partly, why the majority of theologians formulated a very different position on the grave sinner and his status as believer. The Mu'tazilites, for example, an important theological school we have come across already several times in previous episodes, insisted that the grave sinner could not be excluded from the community of believers. At least not in this world, but in the next world, the grave sinner certainly deserved punishment and hellfire. The Murji'ites, another group, held a similar view. No judgment whatsoever should be made about the belief or unbelief of one's fellow Muslims. Only God had the capacity to judge them justly, and He would do so in the world to come. Let's give the word now to Al-Ash'ari, who, as you will see, formulated his own position on this theological problem while explicitly opposing the Kharijites. We believe that we must not declare a single one of the people of the Qibla, and that's the people praying towards Mecca, an unbeliever for a sin of which he or she is guilty, such as fornication or theft or the drinking of wine, as the Kharijites hold, thinking that such people are unbelievers. We hold that we must not relegate any monotheist or anyone who holds fast to belief to paradise or to hellfire. So, for theologians like Al-Ash'ari, wrong actions were not enough to exclude someone from the fold of Islam, especially not in the case of a person as important as the caliph. Looking back at the events unfolding after the Battle of Siffin and the ensuing political turmoil, theologians took an explicit stance against the Kharijites and argued that resistance to the caliph was to be avoided at all costs. Let's give the word to Al-Ash'ari once more. We hold that the four leaders of the Muslim community are rightly guided caliphs, divinely guided and excellent. We declared an error on anybody's part to approve going out. And here Al-Ash'ari uses the word kharaja, from which the name Kharijites is derived, against the caliphs when it becomes evident that they abandoned rectitude. We believe in abstaining from going out against the caliphs with the sword and in abstaining from fighting in civil wars. We believe in obedience to the leaders of the Muslim community. So, here we go. The case of the Kharijites made it clear how closely connected theological and political debates were. We can see the Kharijites as a political movement that revolted against the caliph, and this is certainly also how later scholars remembered them when they wrote about the political upheaval caused by the Kharijites. But at the same time, we have to see that the Kharijites themselves formulated their critique of the caliph in distinctly religious terms, as relating to belief and unbelief and the role of sinful behavior. The religious aspects of the Kharijite movement also stood out for later theologians, as we saw, who formulated their theological positions on the criteria of belief and unbelief in explicit reference to the Kharijites. So, the Kharijites certainly gave theologians enough reasons to prepare for an intellectual battle, but an even more weighty intellectual battle was to be fought between Sunni theologians and Shi'i theologians. Each side held their own religious convictions, and each side believed to be in the possession of better arguments and evidence. But this story has to wait till the next episode of the Kalamopod. the one and only podcast on themes in classical Islamic theology, hosted by Hannah Elman. Thanks for listening, and hear you soon.